This morning, the committee will examine the national and international security implications of climate change. I'd like to welcome our witnesses and welcome members of the public and the press as well. Sherri Goodman is a senior strategist at the Center for Climate and Security, a member of its advisory board and chair of the board of the Council on Strategic Risks. She's also a senior fellow with the Wilson Center. Prior to this, she was CEO and president of the Ocean Leadership Consortium and senior vice president, general counsel, and corporate secretary of CNA. From 1993 to 2001, Ms. Goodman served as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and Environmental Security, the Chief Environmental Safety and Occupational Health Officer for the Department of Defense. Ms. Goodman, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Keating, Mr. McCaul, distinguished members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for holding this important hearing. My views are shaped by my 30 years of experience as a national security professional. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge that while climate change discussions have been polarized, there has been one major exception, and that is security. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, General Scaparrotti, former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, and many other senior leaders of the Department of Defense have been clear-eyed about this issue and the threat multiplier effect on our national security. The intelligence community has identified climate change as a security risk in every worldwide threat assessment for more than a decade, including the 3 years of this administration. Congress has passed multiple important provisions in the last 2 defense authorization bills, including a declaration that climate change poses a direct threat to the national security of the United States. Both were signed into law. I want to thank the members of this committee for their bipartisan support for these measures. Recently, myself, Admiral McGinn, and 56 other senior military, national security, and intelligence leaders who served across Republican and Democratic administrations sent a letter to the President affirming the consensus view in the national security community that climate change is a threat to U.S. national security. Building on this consensus, I would recommend the committee adopt a pragmatic view of the security threat that climate change poses and respond in a way commensurate to that threat. We need to acknowledge that the newly navigable Arctic Ocean is emboldening our adversaries. As the ice melts, Russia and China are increasingly moving to exert control and influence over the region. For example, Russia is building up its military presence in the north and is seeking to monetize the northern sea route by proposing a toll road for military escort through shallow waters close to the Russian coastline. We should incorporate the impacts of increasing water scarcity as a result of climate change and other factors into our risk calculations for international conflict, especially as nations may increasingly be compelled to use water resources as leverage. For example, in the most recent escalation of tensions between India and Pakistan, India used the diversion of rivers as a threat. China holds similar leverage over India with Indus's river origin in China. China may also respond to climate stresses by asserting itself more aggressively over shared resources in its region, such as fish stocks in the South China Sea that are moving northward as the sea warms. Further, China sees an opportunity for strategic benefit vis-à-vis the United States by investing in the climate resilience of countries in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. We should take note and not let China outmaneuver us. Climate stresses across Africa and the Middle East are also increasing economic and food insecurity, driving migration and forced displacement, making it easier for violent extremist organizations to recruit members and increase the likelihood of conflict. The good news, however, is that despite these unprecedented threats, we have unprecedented foresight capabilities, technological advancements, and more sophisticated predictive tools in both the physical and social sciences in the research and development capacities inherent in our many, many national security and civilian agencies mean we can see more of these threats coming with a greater degree of reliability than ever before. The bottom line is that we have a responsibility to look at climate change and its impacts pragmatically in terms of America's national interests. We have a responsibility to account for the current and future climate change stresses in our security calculations, our planning, our foreign policy, and our investments overseas. And we have a responsibility to prepare for the changes that we can see coming. That responsibility includes advancing a robust agenda for addressing security implications of climate change by reducing the scale and scope, investing in resilience, both energy and infrastructure, adapting to those effects that are already locked in, and supporting our partners and allies through American leadership in climate security. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask that my written statement be submitted for the record.
Thank you, Ms. Goodman. You were there right to the second. Unbelievable. Climate change has been categorized as a threat multiplier, which makes existing security risks even worse. Can you comment on how climate change impacts the challenges posed by Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea specifically?
Mr. Keating and members of the committee, I think the clearest example is the Arctic. Today we have a whole new ocean that has become navigable because of sea ice retreating, permafrost collapsing, temperatures rising. Russia is militarizing its portion of the Arctic in order to prepare for a future where it can control routes across the Arctic, as I mentioned, as a toll road and an economic highway to economic and security advantage. China declared itself in 2018 to be a near-Arctic stakeholder and has global ambitions in the region. It's declared that the sea routes across the Arctic are shorter than the current routes controlled by the United States through the Straits of Hormuz and the Straits of Malacca, and it will see advantage as those routes become increasingly navigable in the future. So I think this is a very clear example of an area where we've seen increased geostrategic competition.
Well, just quickly, you know, 40% of the world's population lives within 100 miles of our coasts, and that affects so many other issues as well. So I know, Ms. Goodman, you've spoken to this, but could you speak to how climate change and ocean acidification could disrupt food stocks like fish stocks and fish migration, and what these risks would be imposed to coastal communities and the implication it might have not on just food supply but on our national security?
Yes, absolutely. We're seeing changes in fish stock migration, moving northward, areas that were once very abundant becoming overfished, areas subject now to ocean acidification being less bountiful, but other areas further north and south in the poles becoming more abundant. That puts many of the communities in high intense urban areas in the mid-latitudes at great risk, both across Asia and Africa, combined with extreme weather events from increased hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons, put many of these populations in increasing fragile circumstances.
China is continuing to fire up a coal plant every week, and I would argue is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gas.
Thank you, Mr. McCaul. I would argue that combating the climate challenge is not only about American leadership in the advanced energy transition, which is indeed extremely important, but it's also about American leadership on climate resilience, predictive analytics, and a whole range of advanced technologies that will enable us to have resilient economies for the future. Energy is a piece of it, but there's quite a bit more in the built environment, and as you've heard, I think also from scientists at NASA.
Let me get right to the questions. Repeated national security strategies adopted during the Obama and Bush administrations listed climate change as a key threat facing the United States. But on December 18, 2017, President Trump unveiled a national security strategy which omitted climate change as a threat. So let me ask Ms. Goodman and then Admiral McGinn, What are the consequences of striking climate change from our national security documents? Why don't we start with Ms. Goodman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The consequence is that it makes it more difficult for our national security professionals and our military leaders openly to address the risk today, though many have spoken about it directly. And it also makes it more challenging for American climate leadership to measure up to the other global leadership we believe is so important. This is a fundamental security challenge of our era, and only by being present and exerting our leadership will we be able to recognize and address those threats in a commensurate manner.
So let me again ask Ms. Goodman and also Admiral McGinn, can you elaborate on the response China has had to climate change?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. China is on a global quest for resources to feed and power its domestic economy, but also to expand its global influence. We see this across Africa, throughout Asia, in South America. We see this with increasing extraction of energy and mineral resources, fish stocks, but also increasing foreign direct investment in countries across from the Arctic to Africa and Asia that provide not only resources back home, but leverage into economies of other countries for which American leadership needs to be present to counter that influence.
For 70 years, the United States has been the unquestioned leader of the most powerful alliance or network of alliances the world has ever seen. Now we've announced the Paris climate change talks. We've announced that we won't do our agreed share. What effect does that have on our overall ability to hold together these alliances?
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. I would observe that this week we are observing the 70th anniversary of the NATO alliance, which has been foundational to American security during that period. I grew up during the Cold War and spent my early years working on NATO matters and nuclear security as the fundamental security challenges of our era. I believe that climate change poses an equally fundamental security challenge today, and that American leadership, in conjunction with our allies and partners, is as fundamental to this challenge as it has been within NATO.
We've heard a lot this morning about how climate change is a threat multiplier, and it's been mostly in relation to China and Russia. But I'd like to talk about those fragile states and how they become vulnerable to terrorist recruitment. We've seen a lot of evidence, and I would ask you to comment on some of this, where areas that are people's lives are upset by lack of water, lack of food, just general instability. People are ripe for recruitment. We've seen this in Iraq with ISIS. We've seen it in the Lake Chad area with Boko Haram. We've seen it across the Sahel and Mali. Islamic groups there have used that instability to provide resources and to encourage people to join their side because they can address these issues. Would you say that that is accurate? Have you seen other examples of this? And do we consider the impact of climate change enough as we try to develop a strategy to deal with terrorist recruitment around the world? I'd ask the Admiral and Ms. Goodman to start with that.
Yes, violent extremist organizations like Boko Haram, ISIS, and others are essentially weaponizing water and food, holding vulnerable populations at risk as hostages in circumstances to their own advantage. And that's exacerbated because of the increasing drought that is displacing people in some of these regions across the Sahel and parts of the Middle East. As a result, they can thrive on the additional insecurities created within communities when regions for example, the Lake Chad region, which has shrunk so much over the last decades, can no longer support the fishing, the farming, and the herding populations because of the decline in available water and other resources in the region. So this is happening. There are opportunities, I think, through our own, through Power Africa, Feed the Future, our work with allies and partners across the region to make these communities more resilient and be able to withstand some of these shocks and effects.
I'm going to ask the panel here, because Ms. Goodman, you stated that climate change has led to the mass migration. Is that correct?
Climate change is a factor in the vast migration flows that we see.
How many people, do you have any estimate of how many people have been displaced by climate change out of the 70 million from the Middle East, Asia Pacific region? What % would you say climate change related?
I think the way to think about it, Congressman, is that the factors we've discussed of extreme weather events, sea level rise, temperature rise, increased drought, and water scarcity are exacerbating the reasons that people move.
Ms. Goodman, I'd like to ask a quick question just for some level setting for people here on this committee hearing. Related to the Paris Accord, it is my understanding that the Paris Accord did not bind our actions, the actions of the United States. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Each country sets its own nationally determined commitments.
So to confirm, we, the United States of America, submitted the goals that we thought were appropriate for us and the goals that we wanted to achieve into the future. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. So to draw upon that a little bit further, my question is, how much benefit is the U.S. receiving from the continued dedication of our European allies and UN members, states who still are committed to the Paris Accords and their climate change actions? And then separately, what risks are we taking in your assessment by not being party to these agreements any longer?
Well, I think the risks that we're taking are the continued license for China, Russia, and other great powers of this age to meddle further in our own American interests and with our allies and partners. We see that particularly across Europe today. We see the increasing leverage of both Chinese foreign direct investment, Russian energy leverage across Europe. And without a strong American presence and American leadership, both within the NATO alliance on climate leadership, we put our own security at risk.
The fact that our European allies remain committed to the Paris Accord, what benefit then do we receive because of their continued commitment? Thank you, Ms. Goodman.
I think the right analogy here is within the NATO alliance for 70 years, we have that alliance has enabled Europe and America to be whole and free and to spread the values and norms in a globally constructive and productive manner for our economies and our peoples. We have at various times taken our European allies to account for not fully meeting their financial commitments within the alliance. That's a continuing burden-sharing discussion. It doesn't mean we don't value the alliance and the commitment and the leadership. And I would say here, we're going to have, within the climate community, there's going to continue to be debates about the right levels of commitment and who's living up to their individually, nationally determined commitments. Those are reasonable to have at any given time. It doesn't obviate the need for the overall commitment to address the climate challenge.
Something that we've talked about in this committee before, the research that environmental stressors didn't cause the Arab uprising of 2011, but the impacts of climate change may have served to increase the likelihood of instability. Can you elaborate and provide an example of how climate change has undermined stability in the Middle East?
Well, in Syria, in the years preceding the deadly conflict there was prolonged drought, and that drought drove farmers and herders that had lived peaceably in the rural areas to abandon some of those rural areas and migrate towards cities. That created civil unrest as the as the cities were unable to accommodate, that enabled extremist forces to move in. So the drought is directly connected to the onset of the civil unrest and the increasing violence. It's not the only factor, but it's an exacerbating factor. And if I might add in response to the last question, that climate change is degrading military readiness in the United States today, as we see our bases and stations increasingly at risk from extreme weather events, with costs over $5 billion now to reset both Tyndall and Camp Lejeune, and also the floods recently across the Midwest affecting Stratcom and Omaha, and not to mention the regular sunny day flooding that occurs in Norfolk as well as in your region, in Miami. This is a very significant effect on our military.
Ms. Goodman, could you tell us something about what initiatives the U.S. military is engaging in now or planning to undertake in the future to combat climate change?
Okay, thank you, Congresswoman. I start from the assumption that the military's mission is to provide the most effective and capable fighting force in the world and for the United States. And so the things that the military can and should do in addressing the climate challenge is in support of that military mission. And so, for example, when I observe that extreme weather events are causing damage to military bases, we need to be at the forefront of learning how to reset our base infrastructure to be resilient to those climate effects. And that's part of the military mission. That will have other benefits to the local communities in which the bases are located, from Norfolk to Florida. At the same time, the military is a large user of energy in the United States. And what we've learned over the last several decades is that we can increase the performance and effectiveness of our propulsion systems, of much of our weapon systems, and at the same time, we can be more efficient in our use of energy, and we can take advantage of changes and technology advances in the advanced energy system. So we've seen that, for example, when in Iraq and Afghanistan we were losing people, putting soldiers at risk when they were convoying fuel to the front. We learned how more efficiently to provide that fuel and water to our forces at the front, whether it was by providing different ways of powering our bases with more fuel-efficient insulating foam and other techniques, or by being more efficient in the provision of fuel or water. Those all support the military mission. That technology development, done through a variety of different research and development programs, both in the Department of Defense and in conjunction with the Department of Energy and others, provides valuable benefits for the military mission, and at sometimes, just as it's done through other non-military technologies, has aided in the development, commercialization of those technologies.
The military paid for a study on sea level rise. The results were scary. It's a Washington Post article dated April 25th, 2018. It talks about this small island of Roy Namor, which houses the massive Ronald Reagan ballistic missile defense test site. It is now a routine threat of flooding because of climate change. Can Emmergen or Ms. Goodman, can you explain how important it is to have the Ronald Reagan ballistic missile test site not flood?
Yes, that's very important, Congressman. That's a space radar tracking station that was constructed for that island of Kwajalein at a cost of approximately $1 billion, and could be at risk of being overrun or losing its water sources, or having coastal erosion degrade that capability within the next decade or so.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask Ms. Goodman. Representative Lieu talked about some places that he had served in Guam, and some places specific to his service. My question has to do with something in Pennsylvania. We have a DLA depot in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, that has identified that they are, in fact, being affected by climate change. They maintain $13 billion in materiel. What kinds of things will happen if that particular area is affected, as it anticipates being, by climate change in terms of the downstream effects of the supply chain? If you can comment on that.
Well, it will affect it will degrade the DLA's ability to perform its mission at that location if it's increasingly subject to either extreme weather events or sea level rise or coastal erosion in that Susquehanna area. It does provide, that is an important location for DLA. I know that, and you know, that mission, so they need to make those facilities resilient so they can continue to operate. That's a combination of working both in the built and the natural infrastructure, and then working solutions in conjunction with the surrounding community, and using available technology like predictive analytics and other solutions that will enable us better to understand and anticipate those threats, basically prepare in advance to address those challenges.
Mr. Watkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. My question is for Ms. Goodman. In your testimony, you noted that China published its first public Arctic policy in 2018, wherein it declared itself a near Arctic state and articulated its intention to build a polar Silk Road. Could you elaborate on this?
Yes, Congressman. In 2018, China did release its first Arctic policy. It's been expanding its capabilities to operate throughout the Arctic, declaring itself a near Arctic stakeholder, looking to shorten its shipping times from China into Europe by transiting across the Northern Sea Route, increasing its ice-capable vessels and ability to operate in the Arctic, increasing its extent of research and development across the region, and also increasing its foreign direct investment with other Arctic nations, in particular Greenland and Iceland.
How could the Caribbean begin to prepare itself for this reality that is going to impact the lives of people there and our own lives here, given that we have large populations of folks from those nations? Are there any best practices or ideas of what the roadmap should be short-term and long-term for the Caribbean to prepare itself? Anybody can answer that. Yes, Ms. Goodman?
You know, we've been working through the Center for Climate and Security and with other U.S. federal agencies and private sector and nonprofit partners to develop plans for increasing Caribbean resilience, because we are aware that the combination of extreme weather events combined with the prolonged droughts is making the region more fragile. And the agencies in the Caribbean, like the CDEMA, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, and others, are very attentive to that and really want the technologies and the innovation and ingenuity that can be provided across the range of American universities and private sector entities. So I think this is a very fruitful area to continue to push and advance partnerships as we develop the capability to move from reliable weather predictions of 7 days into the seasonal, subseasonal forecasting. It's going to be very important in the Caribbean and elsewhere.
Admiral McGinn, I was particularly pleased to hear you say, I think essentially, look, the military are pragmatists. We haven't got time for theoretical debates. And the fact of the matter is we're seeing the consequences of something. Call it climate change, call it whatever you want, but we got to prepare for it. And I assume, Secretary Goodman, you would concur with that judgment.
We need to lead by example.
That's right. In a January 2019 DOD report, of the 70, they looked at 79 installations. And in that report, 2/3 of those 79 installations were vulnerable to recurrent flooding, more than a half are vulnerable to drought, about a half are vulnerable to wildfires. And a lot of that clearly is a change, is it not? I'd ask the two of you, from a military perspective, we obviously didn't build installations knowing they were at risk of flooding, drought, wildfires. Something has happened, something has changed that makes a half to 2/3 of those installations vulnerable. Would that be a fair assessment?
I'd just add what that means is that we can no longer fully rely on the historical record to predict what the future will bring.
Good point.
So historic heat records, flooding, storm patterns have changed, and they've shifted. And so when you want to reset and become more resilient for the future, you can't just rely on the past. We need to look at the changing conditions.
Ms. Omar.
Our country is resettling historically low numbers of refugees. And citizens of some of the countries that have been hit hardest by climate change, including Yemen and Iran, Somalia, are currently subject to arbitrary and racist Muslim ban. So, Ms. Goodman, you mentioned in your testimony that your parents were refugees. And as you know, I myself am a refugee. Could you tell us a little bit about the importance of American leadership in refugee resettlement, especially from a national security perspective? Specifically, do you agree with me that it is in our nation's security interest to respond to the global refugee crisis, much of which is caused by climate-related factors, with more care than this president has been, and what might it look like to you?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, my mother, who is a Holocaust refugee and is sitting behind me today, would not be here but for the open arms of the United States. And she was one of the fortunate few able to escape Germany in the 1930s. I fundamentally believe that it's important for America to be a refuge and to welcome those who are seeking shelter. That's not to say we don't need immigration laws and border security. Of course we need that, but we also need to welcome those in need, and particularly when we face the greatest wave of refugees since World War II. Today, many, as you've noted, are fleeing in part because of changes in climate and natural resource scarcities, in addition to seeking economic opportunity.
Appreciate your response. It's one of the American values to see ourselves as a refuge, and I probably would not have survived if America didn't open its arms to welcome my family.
That concludes today's hearing. I again thank our witnesses and all our members for their participation today. The committee stands adjourned.